Dear ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, it is my great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce the President of the European Investment Bank, Mr. Werner Hoyer. Enough praises have been said on the EIB and the President, and these praises were well deserved. The EIB has been investing in Europe for more than 50 years, and by volume it's the biggest multilateral lender. Mr. Hoyer firmly leads this institution, even though the times are challenging. And it is exactly these challenges I would like to highlight, the challenges that the EIB and by extent Mr. Hoyer will be facing in the near and distant future. It is fair to say that with the implementation of the Juncker plan, the bank is facing an unprecedented task. The European Fund for Strategic Investments is not business as usual. The long-term future of the EU rests on the ability of the EFSI to deliver on its objective, and that is to close the large investment gap. The work doesn't have to stop there. The EFSI has a strong potential to become what Europe is lacking, and that is an instrument for macroeconomic stabilization. Making the EFSI deliver is not an easy task to handle, but judging by the pace with which the EIB has been implementing the EFSI, from setting up the necessary processes to the pre-selection of projects, I'm happy to say we are in good hands. And with this thought, I'm pleased to give the floor to the EIB's first man. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the EIB President, Mr. Werner Hoyer.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Minister, dear Vasil, State Secretaries, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, it's a real pleasure to be here at this very, very impressive conference and talk about Europe's response to the investment crisis. This summit, which takes place for the fourth time, has really become an established platform to discuss the most urgent political, financial, and economic issues. This year's event is putting key emphasis on the assessment of the EU's strategic agenda and its implementation. And this is just 1 year after life began anew in Brussels, because we had an impressive and different campaign for the European Parliament election and an unusual procedure to get a new Commission into place. And now 1 year is gone. The debate will focus primarily on fundamental pillars of this agenda: the energy union, the single digital market, the genuine economic and monetary union, the capital market union, and the investment plan for Europe. But this summit will also not fade out the multiple challenges Europe is facing at various fronts: the security crisis, the British referendum, and first and foremost the migration and refugee crisis, which all, to my belief, will have a great impact on the future of European integration. I say this in particular with reference to the refugees crisis, where we see day in, day out pictures of refugees, some of whom risk their lives in dramatic circumstances in order to make their way to Europe. But we also see pictures of scenes showing how people in Europe are reacting to this challenge, a challenge that many people perceive as a threat, but which also can be seen as a great opportunity. At the moment, many questions arise, questions to which there are at present no answers as yet, but which urgently need to be answered. And I am sure that in this context, and this is still a little bit underestimated, the financial dimension will reach the tables of the finance ministers very, very soon. So we better prepare for that. In many cases, this is already the case, but others seem to need more time in order to recognize how deep the challenge is going to be. Even this has already been said so often that it has become common knowledge. The fact remains that we must first of all eliminate or at least mitigate the causes of migration in the countries of origin. And I know that this will take more time. but we must begin now. Wherever possible, people must get back hope and a reliable perspective that their living conditions will improve, that there is an economic perspective, in particular for young people. We must ensure that people in their own interest feel enabled to pursue their way to prosperity and freedom in their home countries. In doing so, I believe that we must also reconsider some fundamental pillars of development policies. I think it's time for a paradigm change in development policy needs to be pursued there. But an activity, a strong, strategically based activity that is geared at producing economic perspectives, growth, innovation, and jobs. And in this case, it is true what we see in other contexts, and I will come back to this today again. It is quite obvious that however you wring out public budgets on the national, on the international, European level, public funds will never be enough to pay for the challenges that we'll have to cope with in the next years, also in the question of migration, but also in the question of climate change, also in the question of the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals to which we just described a few weeks ago in New York. We must also strengthen the transit states, especially Turkey and the Western Balkan countries. For example, within the Western Balkans Conference and with the Western Balkans Conference and the European Youth Employment Initiative, we have two instruments that can be effectively combined in the Balkan states. I remember vividly the Western Balkan summits roughly 8 weeks ago in Vienna, when Chancellor Merkel reminded herself and us that 2 years ago, when she started the Western Balkan initiatives, then called Berlin Initiative, at the same time she started the Youth Unemployment Initiative together with President Hollande and a few others. And by now we have made experiences with that. Last year alone, EIB invested 14 billion euros in loans to SMEs and mid-caps and into vocational training facilities and similar institutions in order to produce perspectives for young people. And this is an instrument that could now be married with the Western Balkan Initiative by offering similar activities to the Western Balkan countries as well, whose leaders very clearly said what is needed. Because one of them put it in a picture and said, well, I have the problem that my people, my young people without orientation, have three choices. Either be resilient, sit it out, and wait for better times. It takes a lot of patience. The others tried to move north immediately, to this country, to Austria, to Hungary, to Sweden, to Germany. And the third group, he says, is turning to the Islamic State. So there is even a security and strategic dimension in this question. So we have to give more attention to the situation in the Western Balkans, and we try to be helpful there. The situation there is currently driving young people who have no prospect of finding work either north to Sweden, Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg, for instance, or it is driving them south into the Islamic State, and here only determined action against the lack of prospects will help. And thirdly, we must overcome the challenges within the European Union. The first thing is the countries of arrival, and let's be honest, we have had a blind eye for too long on the situation on the southern shores of the European Union. There we must create an infrastructure that is fit for human beings and can cope with the humanitarian as well as administrative tasks. But the same applies to realize what the job of successfully integrating people who are able to stay in those countries actually implies for us. The EIB has approached the ECOFIN, the Finance Ministers' Council, 8 weeks ago on this issue, and we'll continue to make offers how we believe we contribute to at least help on the financial side of mitigating this huge problem. Ladies and gentlemen, the TATRA summit is taking on also this challenge, and I welcome this very much because I'm firmly sure that we will never be able to cope with that challenge without arriving at a European solidarity-based solution. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now turn to the agenda point where I'm proud to kick off the discussion. Europe's response to the investment and innovation crisis. I must admit that the organizers of the TATRA summit last year had a very good hand The main aim of the conference was to address Europe's strategic growth agenda, a challenge which has not lost in relevance. The fact is that for decades we have been living off our capital. The result is an enormous investment backlog and need for modernization. Since the beginning of the financial and economic crisis, a pronounced lack of investment has led to a further reduction in productivity growth, which was in any case already low, in all major sectors of the economy. To put this into figures, last year, in preparation for the incoming new Commission, we made a series of studies addressing these issues. Because we wanted to know how big the gap is between what is really needed and what's actually planned in terms of investment in Europe. Let me just, by a few figures, illustrate how dramatically we in Europe are lagging behind. Total investment in Europe is still currently about 15% under the level of 2007. It was not a surprise that in 2007 it dropped. The surprise is that it stayed low for so long now. Compared with the 2007 peak, and I take out the bubble, for instance, in real estate in Spain before 2007, that of course contributed to this high figure, but there's only a very small part of the explanation. But compared with the 2007 peak, the volume of investment has fallen by approximately 430 billion euros in absolute terms, and at 19.3% of GDP is around 2% below the long-term average of a little bit above 21% investment to GDP. In the field of energy and energy efficiency alone, an extra 100 billion euros or so per year would be needed on top of what is already envisaged. And to fill the gaps that still exist in Europe's transport infrastructure, another 50 billion or so a year would be required. This would include investment in expanding intermodal transport and environmentally sustainable mobility in urban areas. The urgently needed expansion of broadband networks, and maybe even more important, of data centers, the amount required comes to 55 billion euros a year. And one issue that people tend to neglect or overlook, to upgrade Europe's water and sanitation systems, including flood protection, to meet demand, it is estimated that a good additional 90 billion euros a year will be needed. If you add this all up, you end up at a figure of more than 500 billion euros per year. And the point of reference for all this is not some dream of environmentalists or people who love trains or people who are just becoming aware of the quality of the water pipes in our countries. The benchmark is the decisions of the European Council, the targets set by the European Council for 2016 or for 2020, respectively. So it is what we have agreed to pursue and not something that we now begin to dream about. To make things worse, this investment gap is complemented by an increasing innovation gap that makes Europe's position in a globalized world even more challenging. At just 2% of GDP, expenditure on research in the EU is not only 1% below the 3% target laid down in the Lisbon Agenda, but also more than 1 percentage point below the levels achieved by other competitors. And if you take the top crop of them, the United States, South Korea, Japan, we can say that only for 1.5 decades we are trailing by 1.5 to 1.8% of GDP behind their expenditures on the knowledge economy in general. If the EU wanted to achieve a 3% of GDP target for research and development, which by international standard is by no means excessively ambitious, we would have to invest another 130 billion a year. So I'm convinced that we have a specific problem in the field of digitalization. Europe's strength in the future will be determined first and foremost by our ability to make up for lost ground in terms of digital technologies and services. I'd even venture to say that the lack of competitiveness in many parts of Europe has also been caused and then reinforced by the fact that in the past we have invested far too little in this field. Of course, structural weaknesses in Europe play a crucial role in explaining the low growth, but lack of investment in this highly competitive sector is also a significant factor. Also here, just a few figures. The data traffic within the EU for communication, for the internet, for video, has increased by the factor of 5 since 2008. If we fail to make the appropriate digital infrastructure available to accommodate this rapid growth, we shall continue to fall even further behind in terms of global competition. We must realize that in addition to the issue of training and human creativity, the data issue will be the key factor in the future to successfully withstanding competition. So in the field of digital infrastructure alone, we must invest 30 billion a year more than we are currently investing, and this does not include yet the consequences to be drawn of the ruling of the European Court of Justice on the question of digital safety, digital security. And because there we will see that another major challenge facing Europe is the fact that it does not have the necessary data center capacity. We are constantly reminded of this indirectly when data protection incidents, if I might call them that, occur. Ultimately, they take place mainly outside Europe and make it impossible for us Europeans to exert any influence because we ourselves are not in a position to make appropriate capacity available. That's another 25 billion euros. Incidentally, here is not only a matter of investment, but also of creating the necessary framework to complete the digital internal market. It's a little bit absurd. There is probably no sector in the world which is by its nature more transnational than the digital world. But when it comes to the reality in Europe, we find out we are far away from that. Just think that only 4% of digital services are of a cross-border nature. 4% in an area where, like few others, national borders can easily be overcome, provided that this is accompanied by an appropriate regulatory framework, which we do not have because we have 28 of them, while the United States of America has one, and India has one, and China has one. So this is a key obstacle to our return to competitiveness. Excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, my aim of enumerating all these figures is not to draw a pessimistic image of the future of our continent, but to draw attention to this development and to show you some means of how this development can be turned around, leading to a more optimistic scenario. After all these figures, one fact is evident: this huge investment requirement cannot be met with public funds alone. When I met Jean-Claude Juncker in the spring of 2014, when he prepared for his bid for the presidency of the European Commission, he was preparing his program, which he would present to the European Parliament. But I told him what I've told you today. Basically, these figures were just produced or found out at that time. He asked what needed to be done to get out of the vicious circle of low investments, low growth, high public expenditures, and what role the EU Bank could play in this respect. Well, we all know that EIB is not the panacea and shouldn't try to be. And EIB activities cannot substitute the fundamental precondition of having the member states implement reforms for achieving an investment-friendly regulatory framework. But the EU Bank can support economic development within this framework and can identify barriers to investment. And we are trying to help Vice President of the Commission, Timmermans, on this crucial challenge the Commission will have to meet in the next years. We do this also by mobilizing private capital on a large scale in order to invest into good and viable projects in the real economy, because the EU Bank is the crowding in bank. That's our job. We are sometimes accused of crowding out the private sector, and whenever I hear that, I go after it and try to remove the problem, because public bank is not there to crowd out other banks. Public bank is there to go into gaps which the market doesn't fill because they're basically market failure. Then it's justified. The public bank, in my conviction, always must justify its intervention. What makes EIB's activity so crucial is the fact that we can leverage scarce public resources and hence maximize their effect by blending them with private capital and focusing on loans, which means that we as a bank actually would like one day these loans to be paid back. This is an experience which really knocked me off when I came to this bank 4 years ago. I had to explain real ministers, even members of the European Council, that we are not a grant organization. We are a bank. We lend money, and believe it or not, we want to have it back with interest. So it's a different model than being a development agency. I mean, this is sometimes very relevant when we do our business outside the European Union, because there sometimes the expectation is we come over them to pour grants out of our huge pockets. No, it's the basic idea is to provide loans to be paid back. And the headline is lending, which is not unusual for a bank, blending, that is the better use of EU funds, and advising, that is closing the gap that sometimes exists between ambition and capabilities. We have a catalytic role through mobilizing private capital, but this is not enough, as there is abundant liquidity on the market anyway. I mean, the situation when EIB went to its shareholders 4 years ago and asked for a capital increase was completely different. Today, liquidity is not the problem. Europe is drowning in liquidity. But what is needed is an increased risk-taking capacity of those who must produce the projects that will bring our economies forward. It is about mobilizing capital in order to invest into projects that require an appetite for taking risk, that currently many private investors do not seem to bring along. And this is not a criticism, this is just a statement of facts. Because what do we expect, for instance, when we clean up the banking system, which we have done, which the finance ministers and the European Parliament and they have done in the last years, successfully in my view, but that also meant to reduce the maneuver space of the banks to come up with new loans. And this has produced problems in many areas. We do not have these problems only in crisis countries. Take, for instance, the effects of the banking regulation on the SME loan activities in the Netherlands, one of the richest countries of the European Union. In the Netherlands, you have serious problem in getting a loan as an SME. And therefore, there is also a challenge for us. So when we talk about crowding in private investors for investments in Europe, that due to market failure would not take place with the support of a public bank, then it means that we have to address the question of risk. And going into risk is nothing new for EIB. Risk-taking is an inherent part of a bank's activity, and we have started to increase our risk-taking capacity 15 years ago when introducing the bucket of the so-called special activities. At that time, it was 250 million euros. This amount has increased in recent years to over 5 billion euros per annum, and will, with the support of the EFSI, or the Juncker plan, will reach some 20 billion euros in the next years. This is the basic difference, the ability of the EU public bank to increase its activities on the higher end of the risk scale. And since then, we have introduced several new lending instruments for certain sectors. But as EIB is not lending taxpayers' money, but needs to collect every single cent we lend by collecting private capital from the financial markets worldwide, almost 50%, by the way, from non-European sources, the rating of the bank is of fundamental importance, making the ability to increase the risk-taking limited in quantitative terms. The volumes we are talking about are between 60 and 90 billion euros per year, which we need to borrow on the international capital markets. And that requires the confidence and the trust of the investors. And the investors will fade away quickly as soon as we produce the impression that we support projects which are not sound, economically viable, and sustainable. So this is the tension you always live in between being a public institution based on the Treaty of Rome, or nowadays the Treaty of Lisbon. But on the other hand, you are extremely market and competition oriented because you have to stand the competition with other people who would like to get these 60 to 90 billion from the investors on the international markets. This is the point where Jean-Claude Juncker and myself agreed to enable EIB to take risks on a much larger scale. And if you want, this was the birth of the Investment Plan for Europe, or better known as the Juncker Plan. And from the start, Jean-Claude Juncker rightly put the lack of investment and decreasing competitiveness of the European Union on the top of his political agenda for the new Commission term. With the Investment Plan for Europe, we now have an instrument in place to address these issues. And this is not limited to EFSI, to the European Fund for Strategic Investment. It's the best known part of it, which, by the way, despite its name, it's nothing else than a managed account inside the bank, backed by a 16 billion euro guarantee of the EU budget and 5 billion in cash from EIB in order to increase the risk-taking capacity of the bank, as just described. So sometimes I need to tell investors, fund managers and others, I need to disappoint you first because the fund is not a fund. And the European Council in December 2015 explicitly changed the conclusions of the European Council by making clear that it is to be an integral part of the EU bank and not a separate new bureaucracy in Brussels. What is new with the investment plan for Europe is the fact that now we can take more risks on a broader and larger scale. Furthermore, the provision of an EU budgetary guarantee for this purpose represents, and that is in my view the most important thing in the medium and long term of the development of the European integration process, the fundamental paradigm change in the use of EU public funds, away from grants and subsidies in favor of loans and guarantees. Now you can say we are talking about 21 billion as a guarantee buffer, and 16 of them out of the EU budget, for a period of 7 years where the EU budget is more than 1,000 billion euros. But still, it is a very important first step away from the subsidies thinking in Europe and towards a more mobilizing activity thinking via grants, via guarantees and loans. I believe that every economic experience shows that somebody who is given a loan with expectation of paying it back probably has a wiser idea for the use of that money than if he or she just gets a lost grant. Although I see there are institutions which depend upon grants, so we have to be very careful. Part of the money coming from the EU budget comes from Horizon 2020. This is in many cases very, very important research money that we'll need also in the future. So the trick for the people in the Commission and the Parliament will be to get these relatively limited fund of 2.7 billion euros out of pockets of the research budget of 80 billion for 7 years, where they do not